My friends, the Pittsburgh Steelers may be closer to finishing this roster than a lot of people realize, but there is still one giant question hanging over this entire offseason, and it's impossible to ignore anymore. Everything still revolves around the quarterback situation, because the organization clearly believes this team can compete right now if they get stability under center. And the more you look at the moves Pittsburgh has already made, the more obvious it becomes that they are building this roster with one specific plan in mind. That plan still points directly toward Aaron Rodgers. At this stage of the offseason, it feels increasingly likely that the Steelers expect Rodgers to eventually sign with the team before training camp. The reasoning behind it actually makes a lot of sense when you break everything down. Pittsburgh believes Rodgers gives them the best chance to compete immediately in 2026. But there's another layer to this that a lot of fans are starting to notice. The organization also sees value in Rodgers helping develop young quarterbacks inside that room, especially Drew Aller during his first year. That changes the entire conversation around the quarterback depth chart. Because if Rodgers arrives, somebody is probably getting squeezed out, and the biggest name connected to that possibility is Mason Rudolph. The reality is harsh, but Pittsburgh usually carries only 3 quarterbacks on the active roster. If Rodgers joins the team and the Steelers remain committed to keeping both Aller and Will Howard around, then Rudolph suddenly becomes the odd man out. And financially, there's logic behind that possibility too. Moving on from Rudolph could free up additional cap space that the Steelers might want to use elsewhere on the roster. What makes this even more interesting is that another quarterback name quietly surfaced as a possible fit behind the scenes: Cooper Rush. Now at first glance, that might not sound like a major headline, but when you look deeper, you can actually understand why Pittsburgh could view him as valuable. Rush already knows the offensive system connected to Mike McCarthy's concepts. He has experience as a starter, and he could function as a low-cost veteran presence who helps younger quarterbacks prepare week after week. The Steelers might not see him as a major contributor on Sundays, but they could absolutely see him as a smart practice squad option and an experienced voice in the quarterback room. And honestly, that tells you a lot about how carefully Pittsburgh is trying to structure this offense moving forward. But quarterback is not the only area where the Steelers are still evaluating potential additions. One of the more surprising names connected to possible interest is Deebo Samuel. And before people immediately react by saying Pittsburgh already has enough receivers, there's actually a reasonable argument here. The Steelers already reshaped this group with the additions of DK Metcalf and Michael Pittman Jr., while also bringing in rookie Jeremy Bernard. On paper, that already looks significantly stronger than last season's receiving core. But if Rodgers becomes the quarterback, history shows he often prefers experienced receivers he can trust immediately. That is where someone like Samuel becomes fascinating. He may not be viewed as a true number 1 receiver anymore, but he still brings versatility that very few players in the league can offer. Pittsburgh could line him up outside, inside, or even in the backfield. He still creates yards after the catch. He still blocks well in the running game, and he still forces defenses to account for him every snap. The Steelers may not need another receiver, but if they decide they want another veteran weapon specifically for a Rodgers-led offense, Samuel suddenly becomes a very interesting possibility. And then defensively, there are multiple veteran names floating around that could strengthen the roster even further. One of the biggest is Christian Wilkins. This is where things get really intriguing because Pittsburgh already has defensive line depth, but you can never truly have enough quality defensive tackles in this division. Wilkins is coming off injury concerns and a strange ending to his time in Las Vegas. But before that, he was widely considered one of the better defensive linemen in football. If the Steelers could land him on a short-term prove-it contract, that could become one of the sneakiest moves of the entire offseason. Imagine adding Wilkins into a rotation that already includes younger pieces Pittsburgh wants to develop. Suddenly, the defensive front becomes even deeper and more physical. The Steelers clearly want waves of defenders rotating throughout games, and Wilkins would fit directly into that mentality if healthy. But there's another defensive tackle option that honestly feels more realistic right now: Daniel Ekuale. Pittsburgh already knows exactly what Ekuale brings to the table. Before his injury last season, he quietly became one of the team's most reliable run defenders. What makes him valuable is his versatility. He can line up at multiple spots across the defensive front, and the coaching staff already trusts him inside the system. If his recovery continues progressing well, bringing him back on another team-friendly deal could make a lot of sense for this defense. And then there's a name Steelers fans already know extremely well: Elandon Roberts. You can already feel some fans wanting this reunion to happen because Roberts became one of the emotional leaders of the defense during his time in Pittsburgh. He's physical, aggressive, vocal, and completely embraces the identity Steelers fans love. More importantly, new defensive coordinator Patrick Graham already coached him recently in Las Vegas, so there's familiarity there. The interesting part is how Roberts would fit alongside players like Patrick Queen and Peyton Wilson. Pittsburgh still needs toughness and run support in certain defensive packages, and Roberts continues to excel in exactly that role. He may not be elite in coverage, but against the run, he still delivers real value. And the deeper you examine all these potential moves together, the clearer Pittsburgh's strategy becomes. They are not trying to completely rebuild this roster anymore. They are trying to finalize it. They believe this team is already close enough to compete, and now they are searching for experienced veterans who can strengthen specific weaknesses without disrupting the structure already in place. But the biggest question still remains unresolved. If Aaron Rodgers officially signs with Pittsburgh, how many of these other veteran dominoes start falling immediately afterward? Because once you connect all the dots, it really starts to feel like the Steelers are building this roster specifically for one final aggressive push to compete immediately, while still trying to protect their long-term future at the same time. That balance is not easy to pull off in today's NFL, and honestly, that's why this offseason has become one of the most fascinating Pittsburgh has had in years. The defensive side of the ball especially feels like a group the organization believes can carry this team deep into the season if the offense simply becomes more efficient. And that's why another name quietly connected to Pittsburgh deserves serious attention: Jamal Adams. Now, this is not the same Jamal Adams from his all-pro years, and everybody understands that, but what makes this situation interesting is the role Patrick Graham used him in last season with Las Vegas. Instead of asking Adams to play deep coverage constantly, Graham moved him around closer to the line of scrimmage, almost like a hybrid linebacker and slot defender. And when you think about how Pittsburgh wants to use certain defensive packages this year, that role suddenly becomes very relevant, especially because of Jalen Ramsey. The Steelers clearly envision Ramsey as one of the most versatile defenders on the roster. He can play outside corner, move into the slot, rotate into safety looks, and even function near the box in certain formations. But the problem with versatile players is simple. If injuries happen, you suddenly need another player capable of handling some of those responsibilities. That's where Adams could enter the conversation as an inexpensive veteran insurance option. And honestly, this entire secondary is becoming more flexible than Steelers fans may realize. The addition of Jaquan Brisker already changed the outlook of the safety room dramatically. In fact, that move may have directly impacted another unresolved situation currently hanging over the roster: Darnell Savage. This situation has become very strange. For a while, many people believed Savage was basically already headed to Pittsburgh. There was strong expectation that he would eventually sign and compete for a major role in the secondary, but even now, nothing has officially happened. Savage and his representatives still reportedly intend to sign eventually, but the delay has created questions, and when Brisker arrived, you could immediately understand why. Savage may have originally viewed Pittsburgh as an opportunity to compete for a starting free safety role, but with Brisker now entering the picture, the path toward that role suddenly looks far less clear. Instead of being brought in as a potential starter, Savage may now be viewed more as a depth piece. And for a veteran player trying to maximize his opportunity, that absolutely matters. The Steelers now face an interesting decision. Do they continue waiting for Savage to finalize a deal, or do they trust the younger options already inside the building? Because there are several young defensive backs the organization appears genuinely intrigued by. Corey Trice Jr. continues developing physically and has intriguing versatility. Dalen Everett is another player who could potentially shift into different secondary roles if needed. Then you have late-round additions and developmental names like Robert Spears-Jennings and Sebastian Castro, players the Steelers reportedly like internally because of their versatility and football instincts. And that right there may be the biggest theme of this entire offseason: versatility. Look at nearly every move Pittsburgh has explored. They want receivers who can line up everywhere. They want defenders who can rotate across multiple positions. They want quarterbacks who can mentor younger players. They want depth pieces with scheme familiarity. They want veterans who understand situational football. This no longer feels like a team making random additions just to fill holes. There's a very deliberate structure behind everything happening right now. Even the way Pittsburgh is approaching the younger players on this roster says a lot. The organization does not appear interested in forcing rookies immediately into impossible situations. Instead, they seem focused on surrounding them with experienced veterans who can stabilize the environment around them. That applies to Aller, Howard, Bernard, and multiple young defensive players as well. And honestly, that may be one of the smartest things this franchise has done in years, because the Steelers have spent too many recent seasons asking inexperienced players to grow up instantly under pressure. Now, they seem far more interested in creating developmental layers around those prospects. Rodgers mentoring young quarterbacks, veterans supporting young receivers, experienced defenders helping stabilize rotational roles. The entire philosophy feels different, but of course none of this truly matters unless the quarterback situation finally reaches a conclusion. That remains the center of everything. If Rodgers signs, suddenly this entire roster starts making complete sense. The veteran additions, the short-term contracts, the push for experienced depth, the urgency in building immediate competition around the roster, all of it aligns perfectly with a team trying to maximize a 2-year championship window while still preparing for the future. And if Rodgers does not sign, then suddenly the Steelers may have to rethink the entire direction of this season, because right now it genuinely feels like Pittsburgh has built almost every remaining offseason decision around the expectation that Rodgers eventually walks through that door. And Steelers fans can probably feel it too. So now the question becomes, if Aaron Rodgers officially becomes the Steelers quarterback, do you believe this roster is actually strong enough to make a serious playoff run in 2026? Or do you think Pittsburgh still needs one more major move before training camp? Because if there's one thing becoming impossible to ignore, it's that the Steelers are operating with a level of urgency that usually only appears when a franchise believes its championship window is opening right now. And the closer we get to training camp, the more this entire offseason starts looking like a calculated gamble that could completely redefine the direction of Pittsburgh football over the next few years. The reason fans are so divided about all of this is simple. On one side, you can absolutely understand the logic behind the approach. The roster itself already looks significantly more balanced than it did a season ago. Pittsburgh added size, versatility, and physicality at multiple positions. The defense still has the core identity Steelers fans expect, while the offense finally appears built to become more explosive instead of constantly playing conservative football. But on the other side, there's still uncertainty everywhere you look because so many of these plans depend on veteran players delivering immediately. That's why the Aaron Rodgers situation hangs over everything like a cloud. If Rodgers comes in and performs at a high level, suddenly the Steelers become one of the most dangerous teams in the AFC because this roster does not actually have many glaring weaknesses anymore. The defense already has playmakers at every level. The offensive weapons are stronger. The offensive line continues getting younger and more athletic. And perhaps most importantly, the organization appears committed to surrounding the quarterback with legitimate support instead of forcing him to carry the entire offense alone. That's a major shift from previous years. You can also feel Pittsburgh trying to modernize the roster construction itself. Look at how much emphasis they're placing on players who can create matchup problems. DK Metcalf brings physical dominance on the outside. Michael Pittman Jr. adds size and reliability. A player